Three, two, one.
And welcome to Human Rights Presents. This is your host, Abraham L. Funchaz Jr. And of course, I'm always excited to come to you via airwaves at KBBG Radio. Communicate to educate. And we have another opportunity today, provided that we have this grant by the Department of Housing and Urban Development to bring this message to you. We are trying to find connections between domestic violence, sexual assault, incarceration and over-incarceration, and housing. I think all of us by now certainly appreciate the fact that those who unfortunately have been labeled felon at any point in their lives have a very difficult time transitioning back into normal society. And I say that with air quotes, of course. But if you have a felony in your background, then chances are you're going to have a much more difficult time getting housing. And for that matter, employment opportunities. You have a difficult time voting on a jury. You may lose public assistance. You may not be able to get food stamps and those other kinds of things that affect the quality of life for anyone. And the way the laws are set up in this nation, obviously, it makes it difficult for anyone to return as a citizen. It's amazing that here in America we actually penalize people forever as a result of them making a mistake that costs them the label of felon. But we want you to know today that as we come to you and talk about critical issues of incarceration, over-incarceration, and particularly sexual assault, domestic violence, we just want you to know that human rights here in the city of Waterloo, and for that matter, human rights organizations all over this nation, are re-evaluating the impact that a felony makes with respect to people transitioning well in our society. Is this the kind of America that we want to call home? If people, and we're talking about people, we're talking about humanity here, if real folks can't, become reacclimated in their own country to what's going on in community by virtue of the fact that society has deemed it permissible, that it's absolutely legal to discriminate against someone who has a felony in their background. And of course, it makes it difficult to get housing, and without a home, it's very difficult for people to, settle down and let their hair down and become themselves and allow their children to grow up in a situation that they feel comfortable. And that's why we believe that these are such important connections associated with housing that we want to make sure that we highlight. And one of those important connections, of course, though, that I want to spend a little more time about today is domestic violence, sexual assault. As we indicated in our last show, this is one of the most underreported crimes in our community as well. If housing discrimination is the most underreported form of discrimination, and housing discrimination or housing is considered the stepchild of the civil rights movement, then certainly a close cousin has to be the negligence involved with reporting incidences of domestic violence, sexual assault. No one wants to talk about this issue. We understand that it's a very private matter. Good folks all over the place are sometimes caught up in an insidious nightmare that is taking place in the privacy of their own homes or in some other places. But they are abusive physically, psychologically, emotionally, and it is absolutely destroying life as we understand it and know it, and is undermining the community as we've come to love it. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to pay more attention to issues associated with domestic violence, sexual assault. It is unfortunate that while we're asking the faith community to be more engaged, more involved in issues like this, and we're not just talking about the Cedar Valley now, we're also talking about all over the world and all over this nation, particularly this nation, that has been known for capitalist, sexist, racist aggression. But we certainly want the faith community to be more involved. The faith community, quite frankly, is culprit, unfortunately, of perpetuating this very violence. Many a times we go and see the show on Sunday mornings without really appreciating or understanding that a lot of times the protagonists in the show the preacher, the deacons, and so many others of the church leadership may be involved, quite frankly, in perpetuating this very kind of violence in their own homes. That's sexual assault, domestic violence in their own homes. And we want to say publicly that we don't think that's a good thing. We have no intention of turning a blind eye. In fact, we believe that as we partner with those survivors, as we partner with other agencies and organizations in town that are bringing more attention to the plight of domestic violence, sexual assault in our communities, that we will always be doing a better job of bringing more attention to an insidious problem that undermines the very fabric of what we call family, and family everywhere. We say it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it's difficult for that village to jump into operation if the whole village is being undermined by issues associated with domestic violence, sexual assault, and issues associated, quite frankly, with incarceration or over-incarceration. Remember, there's a link with all of these issues, because now we're talking about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and we're saying that children who grow up with 4 or more ACEs, that's adverse childhood experiences. In other words, they had exposure to domestic violence or sexual assault. They had exposure to a drunken mother or father. They had exposure to someone in the family who was incarcerated. They had exposure to drug, substance abuse, or mental illness. When a child grows up with 4 or more ACEs in his or her background, they are more inclined to enter early into the criminal justice system, and they could also be more inclined to end up having some kind of mental deficiency as they grow older. And it's because the weight of these adverse childhood experiences is so absolutely crushing, depending on all of the other variables in someone's milieu at home or in the community or the immediate surroundings. It's so absolutely crushing that one's quality of life chances that goes beyond these formative childhood years are almost equal, well defined by the time a child becomes 18, 19, 20 years old. We want to try to make an impact on that kind of development by, first of all, naming the situation. Unfortunately, not a lot of people are talking about it, and we think that at this particular time in history is even more important. Now, this is Human Rights Presents, and I'm your host, Abraham Funches. One of the things we want to do is, through human rights, through the faith community, through community activists everywhere, is to make sure that we are naming the problems as we see them and not simply dismissing them because it's embarrassing to talk about. We have to talk about domestic violence, sexual assault, because all of our people are affected by it, and this does affect our housing choices and housing availability to those of us who have been impacted by incarceration and domestic violence at some point in our lives. And until we talk about it and try to get this ingrained in young people before they become of age and they've already graduated school or dropped out of school, we want to make sure that people have an opportunity to make some good, critical decisions that could profoundly impact their future prosperity in a way that they can be proud of. Aren't you tired of reacting to everything? Can't we be proactive in some areas? And this is our effort to be proactive about a situation that we think is absolutely critical to our community and communities like this one all over these United States of America. Now, let's focus in today, of course, as we continue, shall we call it, part 2, on this issue of domestic violence, sexual assault. One of the things that we began to put out there last time is that domestic violence is extremely costly everywhere. I think there was a study done by the University of Iowa not too long ago that shows that the cost associated with domestic violence, sexual assault, and all of the other court administrative pieces associated with domestic violence in the state of Iowa is a $5 billion enterprise. That's a lot of money, ladies and gentlemen. I am saying $5 billion with a B, not $5 million with an M. It's extremely, extremely expensive when we think about the costs associated with domestic violence, sexual assault. And when you began now to narrow down this problem even further. Obviously, this is a terrible issue that affects our women and children everywhere. And of course, we say this with tongue in cheek. We understand that there are some men, a small number of men, that may be abused by women, but usually 87% of the time anyway. We're talking about women who have historically, who are presently being abused by a male perpetrator. Women everywhere, regardless of their race or class, are devastated by this particular issue in community, and unfortunately the faith community and other institutions in community are saying absolutely nothing about it. And so people who are victimized by this particular crime in community obviously sometimes feel as if they have no safe house or safe place to go. And in faith communities, the mosque, the church, and other institutions like that, they're supposed to have, and that's what's so appealing about those particular messages that come out of those institutions of higher learning, those institutions of improved moral ground, a safe house, a safe space, a place where you can let your head down, a place where you can articulate your pain and have an understanding soul, be able to identify with that pain and hopefully point you in the right directions so that you can receive the comfort and the healing that you need in order to get over, in order to see another day. Unfortunately, this is where we have failed miserably because too often, unfortunately, those very institutions that I just named are complicit in the problem. The protagonists in those institutions are sometimes guilty themselves of the very problems that we're trying to describe. Things are getting better, we hope, but of course we are also very, very aware of the adage that says the more things change, the more things stay the same. But as we look at this issue of domestic violence, sexual assault, one of the things that we certainly know, and we have no shame in saying this and expressing this, and that is this, that while women, regardless of race and class, everywhere are affected by this problem, we know that black women are affected by this 3 and 4 times as much as their white counterparts. Now, why is that? Well, we began to discuss last time Ray Rice and this issue with him apologizing for what he was guilty of doing against his now wife at the time that we saw the wife falling out of the elevator. She was his fiancée, and she ultimately decided to marry him. And so she connected with him, and now as his wife, they have been seen together, at least while he's saying he's sorry, he's apologizing. He wants to do the right thing. He wants to overcome, these terrible tendencies that he has in his life, etc., etc., etc. And while, on face value, we appreciate those kinds of statements, at least owning up to the problem is a step in the right directions. We would like to see this problem absolutely eradicated. The problem associated with Ray Rice is that he only got 2 suspensions. He was suspended 2 days, or 2 games, for the violence he perpetrated against his wife. And she's a beautiful woman, if you've ever had a chance to see her. She's a beautiful woman, but he only got 2 games of suspension, while other men have been suspended for several games more for things like drug paraphernalia, like marijuana, weed of all drugs, which is now becoming, quite frankly, legal in a lot of states all across these United States of America. And let us never, ever forget Michael Vick. My God, the number of days he got incarcerated because he was fighting dogs is absolutely stunning to me. I'm still spellbound. I mean, it boggles the mind to think that he had to spend that kind of time and lose that kind of money and skip out on all those endorsements because he was fighting dogs. But he got more time than Ray Rice for beating up a black woman. And so the point that has been made here is that black women's lives are not as valued as other people's lives in these United States of America. Now, in the large context, this is not surprising anyone. We know that all across these United States, black life is not valued as highly as white life is. That is why we have ironclad cages of poverty and alienation and what have you in major metropolitan areas all across this nation. When we look at big cities like Chicago, New York, and other places across this land, Philadelphia in particular. Maybe New Orleans can be included in this number, Dallas, Houston. When we look at the major metropolitan areas and we look at these ironclad cages of poverty, illiteracy, alienation, violence, crime, it's clear that by its very existence, people don't care about black life. Because when we look at these ironclad cages of poverty that I just described, they are usually populated by black, brown, and poor individuals. If the United States of America actually cared more about black life, this would have already been addressed in a much stronger fashion. This would have already have been addressed by throwing more monies at the situation and putting more forces on the street in order to curb this situation, in order to try to make things better. But that has not happened, and therefore the verdict is in. Black life is not as valued as white life is. As long as the suburbs are taken care of, as long as people are not talking about problems over there, then they could care less about what's happening necessarily in the major metropolitan areas where black, brown, and poor people populate and congregate, and so forth and so on. And so within this mix, and that's the context that we're operating with, black women then all of a sudden, and black female life has become cheapened even more. In the midst of all of that, where we have so many murders among our people, Chicago now being referred to as Chirac, where so many black men are killing each other left and right, had it not been happening so often, had it not become so familiar to us, and that is a dangerous thing, that kind of violence, that kind of devastation and destruction will become so familiar with us that this devastating problem now doesn't seem as devastating because we've become desensitized to it. Well, that's alarming. But within that mix, black female life has become even less important. And I have data to prove it. This is not just conjecture. This is not just Abraham Funches talking. No. We've got data to help paint this picture from the Violence Policy Center, a policy center that engages in research, investigation, analysis, and advocacy for a safer America. They report black women murdered by men at a rate more than 2.5 times higher than white women, the study finds. Listen to this. Black women are most often killed by a gun and almost always by someone they know. Black women face a disproportionate share of fatal domestic violence in America, according to the new Violence Policy Center report, When Men Murder Women, an analysis of 2011 homicide data. In 2011, 492 black females were murdered by males at a rate of 2.61 per 100,000, compared to a rate of 0.99 per 100,000 for white females. The annual report is released to coincide with Domestic Violence Awareness Month in October. The study covers homicides involving one female murder victim and one male offender, and uses data from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's unpublished supplementary homicide report. This year's report applies to 2011, the most recent year for which data is available. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is the part I want you to really pay attention to, because, you know, in some people's minds, our emphasis on domestic violence, sexual assault in the community is a disservice to community. And I understand perhaps the concern. They feel that we are now beginning to probe. We are advocating that people air their dirty laundry and so forth and so on. We've heard the arguments before. But look, we're tired of reacting to, you know, someone after they have already lost limb and life. Perhaps if we talk about these kinds of things before these issues become so explosive, the perceived victim can get out of the situation before things really turn bad. Listen to these findings, though. Here are some of the report's findings related to black females murdered by males. Here's one. While the relationship could be determined, or where the relationship could be determined, 94% of black females killed by males knew their killers. Nearly 15 times as many black females were murdered by a male they knew than were killed by male strangers. This is a very important piece of data. The fact that black females know the perpetrator of their crime, that's important to know. Here's point number 2. Of the black victims who knew their offenders, over half of them were wives. 52% were wives, common law wives, ex-wives, or girlfriends of the offenders. 93% of the homicides were intraracial. Firearms, especially handguns, were the most common weapons used by males to murder black females. Where are all these guns coming from that we find prevalent in our communities today? Where are they coming from? If you hear and listen to the local police department, they catch perpetrators riding down the street on bicycles with guns. They talk about teenagers with guns. Where are all of these guns coming from? Why is it so easy for young men and women to get access to guns? It's still mind-boggling. Oh, what a public policy issue we have to deal with as human rights, as faith community folks, as community activists, Department of Corrections, everywhere. But anyway, firearms, especially handguns, were the most common weapons used by males to murder black females. When the murder weapon could be identified, 51% of black female victims were shot and killed with guns. Within that group, 82% were killed with a handgun. Another fact, in homicides where the age of victims was reported, 12% of black female victims were less than 18 years old, and 5% were 65 years of age or older. That's alarming. It is our young babies that are being shot down, snuffed out, before their light even has time to grow. Because of domestic violence, sexual assault, the community overall has turned a deaf ear, a silent voice. Our silence has been deafening on this particular issue. And so the interconnections between domestic violence, incarceration, and housing discrimination are so integral, and we're not even talking about it. We've got to change this practice. We've got to cultivate the practice of talking about these critical issues that affect our most precious commodities, and that is our beautiful black men and women in our communities that serve as backbone to everything that we hope to accomplish one day. And then maybe as we talk about these issues and air out this so-called dirty laundry more often, we may save lives. Don't fear talking about dirty laundry. You may just find, have you ever looked through the laundry and found money? I know I have. And perhaps as we talk more about our dirty laundry, we may find something of value and treasure there. Let's begin to cultivate the practice of doing so. Look at this one. The vast majority of homicides of black females murdered by males were not related to any other felony crime. Most often, black females were killed by males in the course of an argument. In cases where the circumstances could be identified, 87% were not related to the commission of any other felony. They were arguing, and someone decided to take upon himself to end the argument by absolutely killing the other debater, period. I don't like what you're saying. I disagree with what you're saying. You're insulting me. You're hurting my feelings. You're attacking my ego. Therefore, I will respond by taking you completely out, because my tolerance level for any counter argument is extremely, extremely low. Do you realize we just had an incident this past weekend like that, where someone under the age of 30 lost his life because of an argument? A shotgun blast, from what I understand. Listen, the sad reality is that women are nearly always murdered by someone they know, said the Violence Policy Center Legislative Director, Kristen Rand. Already, many elected officials and community leaders are working tirelessly to reduce the toll of domestic violence. Yet, despite these efforts, the numbers remain unacceptably high. We need new policies in place, from local communities like Waterloo to the federal government, to protect women from harm. 9 women each week are shot to death by their husband or intimate partner. I think that's worth repeating. 9 women each week. 9 women each week. 9 women each week are shot to death by their husband or intimate partner, said Shannon Watts, founder of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. That's nearly 500 domestic gun violence deaths each year, more than twice the number of servicewomen killed in military conflicts since the Korean War. We urgently need better policies that protect women and their families from this senseless violence. No American adult or child should live in a perpetual state of fear. Is inhumane. And that is, for me, the real kicker. The idea of living in a perpetual state of fear. When we find ourselves in these situations where children can acquire so many adverse childhood experiences, they can acquire so many ACEs, we oftentimes find them living in a perpetual state of fear. So the idea of exploring what it means to attain a high quality of life, like getting a decent house in a decent neighborhood where they can be themselves, is always going to be a challenge until we begin to eradicate these problems that are at the base of societal disintegration. Issues like domestic violence and, of course, incarceration. And, of course, we see the connections. You can become incarcerated because of domestic violence, abuse, or sexual assault, and what have you. These issues have got to be eradicated. Look, I've got 60 seconds, and I think I want to close with something like this. Let us go back and revisit an article written by Charles Ellison, and he closes out his article this way. There is no substantive policy focus or data-driven public debate on the impact of domestic violence on black women and its devastating impact on our larger African-American community. We need to change that here in the city of LA. Let's change that. The data speaks very clearly that black women are 2.5 times more likely to be killed because of domestic violence, sexual assault in the community. So we need to change that. Instead, we have focused onlookers by blaming victims. As a society and as a community, we foolishly pass on opportunities to know more about the abused black women who die at 3 times the rate of their white counterparts, or the 30% of sisters overall who have suffered violence at the hands of intimate partners, according to the Violence Policy Center. Rarely do women of color who serve more time for self-defense see justice, and rarely do we hear our elected officials talk about it unless pushed by tragedies that capture headlines. Well, in the meantime, we're happily venerating celebrities like Chris Brown and on the stage and Ray Rice on the field. And we also celebrate people like R. Kelly, who supposedly was caught in the very act. And yet, although that's changing though, I think some people are speaking out a little bit more now against R. Kelly. We find that this is, quite frankly though, a very, very bad practice, and we've got to change this. I've got to go. This is Human Rights Presents, Abraham L. Funches Jr. See you next time.
Same to you.